Hi, I'm Barbara Samuels and welcome back to another episode of Type 2 Makeover, where I give you my proactive, patient approach to dealing with type 2 diabetes. Ever heard the words glycemic index, glycemic load? Confused? Well, I was when I first came across them, but I think I've got my head around it now. So the glycemic index is a measurement tool, and what it does, it measures the amount of carbohydrate that exists in each and every food product. On top of that, it measures the impact that the carb has once we've eaten it to see whether it spikes the blood sugar or keeps it nice and balanced throughout the day. So the glycemic index is ranked from 0 through to 100. So if a food is registered as below 55, it's seen as a low glycemic index food. If it's above 55, it's a high glycemic index food. Together with the glycemic index, we have something called the glycemic load. And what this is, it's a combination of the glycemic index together with the amount of food that you eat in any given meal or in any given day. And then that's calculated, and then it comes out with a glycemic load. So if a meal or food comes under 10, it's seen as a low glycemic loaded food. If it's above 20, then it's a high glycemic loaded food. Now, this kind of measurement tool assumes that foods are eaten in isolation, but we know they're not, because we usually have foods, so we have carbs, we'll have protein, fat, and fiber. But the thing is when we eat these foods in a combination, the only thing that gets measured are the carbohydrates. And so what can happen is that you're over-consuming, which then makes you put on weight, which is then stored as fat, which then dampens the ability of insulin to work so that it moves the sugar through the blood into the cells, which then turns it into energy. So there was some research carried out back in the 80s, in 1983. There was a nutritionist called Phyllis Crapo, and she was from the University of Colorado. And she worked with patients who had type 2 diabetes. And obviously she would advise them to refrain from eating sugar because that would spike the blood sugars. At the same time, they continued eating starches. She was then open to the suggestion that actually starches can have as negative an impact on the blood sugars as refined sugar. Anyway, so said, so done. There were tests and trials carried out, and what was found was actually foods such as white potatoes and white bread, which is made by white flour, which then contains a toxin called alaxon, which attacks the pancreas. And so these types of foods spike the blood sugar. So her work has been continued in terms of, there's another doctor called Dr. David Jenkins, he's from the University of Toronto, and then following on from him, there's Dr. Jenny Brand-Miller, and she's from the University of Sydney. So they've been continuing this work around the glycemic index and the glycemic load, but however, there are limitations in this measurement tool. So for example, what gets measured is the amount of carbohydrates. What doesn't get measured, as I said, is this sense of if you're eating with proteins or fat or fiber. Also, if you think about it, our bodies, each and every one of us, is so unique and so different. And actually, the way that we digest carbohydrates is going to be different for every person that exists on the planet, but also every person that has type 2 diabetes. On top of that, the amount of insulin that we need in terms of digesting and processing that meal is going to be different. If that's the case, that then undermines this scientific approach to measuring the impact that carbohydrates has on our body. On top of this, if you think about it, food manufacturers create new foods, thousands of new foods every single year. And they can't test them all because the average amount of foods that are tested is just 5%, which then means that there's up to 95% of foods that are never tested. But also it'd be very costly, extremely time consuming, because you'd have to test all of those thousands of food on thousands or millions of people to see whether there's any consistency in terms of the impact that carbohydrates has on our bodies, but the way it spikes the blood sugars. So that's why I say it undermines this statistical as well as scientific process called the glycemic index and glycemic load. So for me, when I started to put those pieces of the jigsaw together, it just didn't make sense. On top of this, we've got this sense of, well, actually, depending on where you live in the world, there isn't a legal requirement that foods have to go through this whole process of being, is it a GI food, is it G-loaded food? So if there's no legal requirement, we're in a position whereby some foods where we're assessing, oh, this is okay, I can eat this. But for other foods, well, I can't eat that. But on top of it, the whole glycemic index and the glycemic load was actually created for people who have normal blood sugars. And so where, for example, with people who have diabetes, our blood sugars have been compromised to a certain extent, it doesn't give a true representation of the impact that a glycemic index food or glycemic loaded food has on our bodies. So that's something to be mindful of as you're healing yourself and you're aiming to transform your health and your body. Now, there's an alternative to this glycemic index and glycemic load, and that's being proposed by Dr. Eric Westman. And he's from the Duke University Medical Center, and he undertook some research in 2008, which was published in Nutrition and Metabolism. And what he was examining was the impact of a low carbohydrate diet versus a low glycemic diet on people with type 2 diabetes. So I follow a low carbohydrate diet. That's the way that I've done it, or a way of eating as opposed to calling it a diet. Food brings us so much pleasure and joy, and as we're growing and healing and transforming our lives, then the whole idea is that we should be enjoying our food, but at the same time using our wisdom in terms of what works for our individual unique bodies. Anyway, he undertook this research and published it in 2008 and discovered actually that a low carbohydrate diet or way of eating was the better way of facilitating the well-being of people who have type 2 diabetes. Now, there's lots of controversy out there in terms of different factions and organizations and scientists and the food manufacturers who have polarized positions. Some fall in the camp of low carbohydrates, some fall in the camp of low GI, and what they assert is that there isn't enough evidence to prove that low carbohydrates food is better than a low GI food. So there's lots of debate going on. All I'm inviting you to do is use your wisdom. I want you to stay well. I want you to stay safe. Use your wisdom. Any questions or queries, get into a dialogue with your doctor, but then appreciate there are alternative ways in which you may be healing and treating your body. So that's it for this episode. And the question of the day is, do you tend to follow a low carbohydrate or a low GI way of eating? Would love to know what your preference is or what you actually do. Or if you've got another way of eating, put your answers in the comment box below. If you've got any other questions or queries, pop them in the box below. I always love to talk with you, and let's get into a dialogue around this. And stay well until the next episode.